Back on the record, the time is 5:34.
Doctor, as we sit here today on April 12th, 2018, do you have an opinion as to whether or not the NCAA has provided an adequate warning to football players regarding the risk of future brain damage or death resulting from playing football?
Yes.
What is that opinion?
They have not, nor have their member institutions.
Doctor, one of the terms that you used earlier today that I don't think we had a definition or discussion of was anti-warning. Do you recall discussing
Yes.
that? Can you please explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what an anti-warning is?
Well, an anti-warning is something that gives you false reassurance that something that's bad is not bad. So in the case examples I gave here, it's the things the NCAA said, for example, when they said helmets could reduce or eliminate concussions, when that wasn't true. That's giving someone false reassurance that wearing a helmet will protect them when it actually won't.
Objection, non-responsive.
Do you have an opinion, Doctor, whether or not Greg Pletz and other college football players at that time received anti-warnings from the NCAA?
Yes,
And what is that opinion?
they did.
Do you have an opinion whether that's continuing today?
Yes,
What is that opinion?
Objection form.
it is.
Doctor, in the 3-year epidemiology training program that you discussed earlier, was anti-warnings part of that training?
No.
Is that a field that somewhat developed after that time?
Yeah, the term itself is one I coined in the textbook of warnings and risk communication. It's been adopted by other authors since that time.
And I'm going to come back and get to all that, but to make it clear, but you've actually been an author who's been published and peer-reviewed discussing anti-warnings. Do I understand your testimony correctly?
That's
Objection
correct.
leading.
Okay. What is an example of an epidemiological study, Doctor?
There's, if you want to look at we can look at the McKee study that we talked about earlier. And in that case, they took a group of people and looked at their brains and determined what percentage of them who had CTE, and looked at and tried to get an idea of what the rate of CTE was in people who had chronic trauma with symptoms.
Do you have an opinion, Doctor, as to whether or not the work done by the folks at Boston University regarding CTE constitutes epidemiological work?
Yes,
What is that opinion?
it does.
And
Well, some of it does. The one example I gave you. I mean, they've done other things that
Sure.
they've done case reports and other things. Case reports actually an epidemiologic study too.
do you give credence or put import on case studies as well when you do your analysis and render opinions about what's out there in the scientific literature?
Yes.
You were also asked some questions about rate ratio, and I'm not sure if the testimony came out clearly on that. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Objection form.
Yes.
Please do.
So a rate ratio in the context of what I was saying was that you'd look, for example, at a group of football players and follow them 30 or 40 years later and say, okay, 10% of them had CTE. And you take a group of other people who went to college with them, who were otherwise the same in terms of gender, socioeconomic status, other life experiences, and let's say 10% of the football players had CTE, and 1% of the control group had CTE, the rate ratio would be 10, okay, or 1,000% increase.
Objection, non-responsive.
Doctor, when we were discussing what public health is, you discussed the importance of disease prevention. Can you tell me some of the important ways that public health is utilized to help prevent disease?
Okay, well, the most important, let's see that.
I don't know if I asked that quickly. Would you like me to rephrase it?
Let me read it.
Objection form.
Yeah, I think
Why don't I
it's a
try a
pretty
different
vague
question? Let me try a different question. In terms of a public health perspective, is it important to warn people about hazards?
Yes.
Why is that important?
Well, it's important for a number of reasons. First, there's a question of ethical obligation and informed consent. Informed consent being a medical construct that's also applied to other decision making. And by that I mean, if you agree to play football and assume the risks of playing football, you need to know what those risks are before you make that decision. Otherwise, you're making an uninformed decision. People have the right to know what the risks are when they go play a sport. Secondly, when you warn people about the risks and the things that they shouldn't do, then you can reduce the incidence or the number of people who get concussed. If you reduce the number of people who get concussed, you reduce the number of people who are going to get dementia and CTE as a result of concussions. And by that I mean you need to tell them that if they get injured with a concussion or a subconcussion or a question of a concussion, they need to be evaluated for that. And they need to not play until they're evaluated and can go back. Now it turns out that Bazarian study that I mentioned before is a crucial study that should be told to people, because that goes beyond what I just said. That's a study of Division III football players who never had a concussion documented while they played. But 6 months after not playing, they had a statistically significant increase in brain abnormalities, things that could be seen on a CAT scan, things that could be measured, that are likely things that come before getting CTE. So you need to tell players that you don't even need a concussion. Playing this sport with the repetitive contact that goes unnoticed can result in brain trauma that they don't know about. That's particularly why this kind of injury needs to be warned about, because you have these injuries that occur that go unrecognized by the person who's injured. There's no warning properties. It's not like if I cut an onion, I would know, oh, there's an onion here, maybe I should stay away from it. These are injuries without onion properties. Okay? You have to tell someone about it because there's no way for them in their own five senses don't tell them they've been injured. And they certainly don't tell them that the injuries they receive then may cause them to get dementia in 30 or 40 years. Nobody has an idea about that. No one knows about this Bazarian result or other subsequent studies that support this.
Have you
Objection non-responsive.
Have you looked at the NCAA's website as part of your work in this case?
Yes.
Did you see any reference to the Bazarian study?
No, or nothing like it.
Have you seen any reference on the NCAA website to the work of Dr. Cantu or Dr. McKee?
No.
Objection form.
Have you seen anything on the NCAA website regarding the study done by the Mayo Clinic of 1,700 brains?
Objection form.
No.
Is that the type of information that you believe would be necessary to have adequate warning and informed consent?
Yes.
Doctor, do you have an opinion whether or not Greg Pletz's agreement, if you will, to play college football was informed consent?
Yes.
What is that opinion?
It was not informed consent. He was not informed of all the things that we've discussed here that the NCAA knew. He was not informed of all the things that the NCAA knew they should do to prevent concussions and didn't do, because they've kept all of that information secret.
Objection form. Objection non-responsive.
Well, having asked the question, I'm pretty sure I thought it was responsive. Doctor, I want to stay on warnings for a second, even though I know there's more issues on public health, and we'll get to those. You have a book in front of you. Can you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what that is and perhaps hold it up?
Sure. This is a textbook of it's called the Handbook of Warnings, and written by Michael Wogalter, and I wrote the first chapter after the introduction, and I think it's chapter 51. That's on anti-warnings, 51.
What year did you write that chapter, Doctor? Do
This
you
is
recall?
2004 text. Well, it's actually 2006 textbook. I probably wrote the paper in 2004, 2005.
And this is a medical textbook, doctor?
It's a public health textbook, generally be considered a public health book.
And as you understand it, is it used in schools across the country?
Objection form.
I believe so.
Is that a peer-reviewed publication?
The chapters were peer reviewed. In other words, my chapter was reviewed by several of the other authors and other people, came back for comments and went back. So both of my chapters were peer reviewed.
And you know, it may be helpful for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, because we've heard some discussion today about whether a study is peer-reviewed and whatnot. Can you just generally explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what that process is?
Objection form.
Okay. The process is since, say, the last 10 or 15 years. You submit an article to a journal, and then the editor of the journal would send it to 2 or 3 people to read it, make comments about it, suggest changes, and suggest whether it be accepted or rejected. Now, in general, the peer review process is not rigorous at all. They don't review the underlying data. They don't check the data for cheating, that is, fraudulently putting numbers in tables. And it's an all-volunteer army. Peer reviewers are not paid. So the amount of work they put into the journal and reviewing is quite variable. I know about this because I was the editor of a journal for about 9 years.
So, Doctor, when counsel for the NCAA stuck out a couple of those publications for you, I think Exhibits 5 and 6, and said, they're peer-reviewed, doesn't that mean something to you? What does that mean to you, if anything, about whether we give more credence to those papers?
Objection form.
Well, not knowing anything about the peer review process, and you can't really you can't know what's under the carpet in those journals because they don't publish the peer reviews and they don't say how they're done. You can't say an article's better or worse because it was peer reviewed or not, really.
I'd also like to ask you about safety programs. You feel familiar with that term?
Yes,
Is that something you've written about before?
yes,
Have you, in fact, helped companies develop safety programs?
yes.
In the documents that you've reviewed, the testimony you've seen, have you seen any evidence to indicate that at the time Greg Pletz played collegiate football, the NCAA had implemented any sort of safety program to help him or his teammates or opponents?
Objection
No.
form.
Have you seen any evidence even today that the NCAA has what you would term a safety program relating to concussions and brain injury?
Objection form. Objection leading.
No.
Doctor, what would be, well, let me strike that. Do you have an opinion as to whether or not the NCAA should have a safety program regarding concussions and head injuries?
Yes.
Do you have what is that opinion? Let me do that first.
They say they have a moral, ethical, and legal obligation to do that. They say they were established to do that, and they've testified under oath in Congress that they have such moral, legal, and ethical obligations to do that.
Doctor,
Objection form. Objection non-responsive.
what year was the NCAA founded?
1906, with a different name.
Correct.
The name didn't come in until 2 or 3 years, 3 years later, I think.
Do you have an opinion as to when the NCAA should have had a safety program as such as we've discussed?
1906.
Do you have an opinion whether or not the NCAA should have a medical director?
Yes,
What is that opinion?
they should.
What year did the NCAA very first time, get a medical director?
2013.
Did you say 1913?
No, 2013.
And the NCAA was founded what year?
1906.
Is it your testimony, Doctor, it was 107 years for the NCAA to have a medical director?
Objection leading.
Yes,
Well, let's rephrase it. How many years did the NCAA go without a medical director?
107.
Do you have an opinion as to when the NCAA should have first had a medical director?
Yes,
What year?
1906. They were established to reduce concussions. That was their purpose. It's a medical problem.
Objection non-responsive.
Doctor, do you have an opinion as to whether it would have impacted Greg Pletz and the health of other football players if the NCAA had developed a safety program and had a doctor in 1906 instead of 2013 for a doctor and never for a program?
Objection form.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Might have. Depends who they hired and how they did it. It might have been a facade like some of the other things they'd done.
Objection non-responsive.
Doctor, what did you do after you went to Harvard and completed that training? I think you said you were certified in occupational health.
Board certified in occupational environmental health, yes.
Can you explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what occupational health is?
Occupational health is the study and treatment and prevention of injuries and diseases that occur to workers.
Is that qualification, that expertise relevant to you in this case?
Yes.
Why is that?
Well, these are workers, and they get injured, and they're no different than any other worker who might get injured. There's head trauma in construction. There's programs to prevent head trauma in construction. There's educational programs to prevent head trauma in construction. It's just no different. It's just that there's more often head trauma in football than in any other occupation that I'm aware of, by probably a factor of 1,000 for linemen or more.
Objection non-responsive.
Doctor, after you got your certification, did you undergo further training or experience with respect to occupational health? Or was that kind of the end of it? You have to do a residency and all that?
I did it. Well, that was the 3-year program. The public health school and the 2 years at NIOSH was a residency together in occupational environmental health.
Okay. I've also heard the term, I think today, but generally the term preventative medicine. Is that a term you're familiar with?
Yes.
Can you explain that to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, please?
Well, preventative medicine is a subspecialty of medicine, and there are 3 areas under that subspecialty. One of them is occupational environmental health. The other one is preventative, so it's preventive medicine, and that deals with preventing health problems in the general population or in subpopulations like football players. And then the third is aerospace, really not related to the other 2, but it's the same subspecialty. And I did a 3rd residency in preventative.
Where'd you do that residency?
Kearney Hospital in Boston.
Your experience, knowledge, expertise in preventative medicine, is it important to you with respect to your opinions in this case?
Yes.
Can you explain why?
Yes, we learned how to evaluate medical literature, do epidemiologic studies, understand the importance of those studies, understand how to develop and determine whether injuries cause disease, long-term disease, like CTE, and we learned how to develop warnings programs, training programs, so that those injuries could be prevented and to reduce the amount of concussions and therefore chronic traumatic encephalopathy and dementia.
And on top of all the other experience we've talked about, have you actually treated patients as well?
Yes.
For how many years did you treat patients?
Well, I treated patients since my residency, but I ran a clinic from 1989 to 2001, 2002. Where I treated a lot of patients.
And I believe you testified earlier today you've continued to see patients periodically up until quite recently. Is that fair?
Objection form.
Yes.
So if we put all that together, I believe you said you were 65 years old. Is that right?
Yes.
So how many years of practice, experience, and knowledge in medicine do you have?
Probably 35.
Are you still a licensed physician today?
Yes.
Can you tell me what states you're licensed, please?
Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Mississippi.
Well, that's kind of what, as I'd tell my 13-year-old, one of those does not belong. Tell me how you ended up in Mississippi.
Beginning in 1974, I helped set up a program between Tougaloo and Brown University Medical School, and then I helped develop a rotation with Robert Smith, who was one of 3 African American physicians who actually were permitted to admit patients in Mississippi, and I worked with him, and then went back during my residency and worked with him during my residency. And so I've kept my medical license in Mississippi since that. I got my medical license in '79 probably, but I started working with him as a medical student.
Certainly from the discussions we've had today, you're a busy fella. Can you tell us the kinds of things you're still doing today with respect to whether it's medicine or teaching or your knowledge and experience and how you're using that?
Sure, I do research on public health issues, particularly related to how companies approach and deal with public health problems, particularly the history of the development of knowledge about public health problems. In other words, who knew what when. And I publish on those areas. I teach about that in a course that I teach at Brown. I teach about how public health can be changed, the different ways you can impact on communities through education and other activities. I also run a nonprofit organization called Global Health Training and Service. I work with, it's been going on one form or another since '86, and I work with medical and nursing schools in Africa, Southeast Asia, actually India as well, and Latin America, helping develop community-oriented primary care medical and nursing school curriculum models. And in the case of Vietnam, we helped get a $150 million grant from the World Bank to redesign the health system in Vietnam, particularly the primary care health system in Vietnam. That was done by people at BU primarily, with our support. And we're currently co-sponsoring the head of the Gates Foundation, person who's been in charge of dealing with primary care training programs globally. And we've traditionally done a lot of funding in the area of women's health internationally. And so that's what the nonprofit does. And those are my probably my 3 main activities.
With respect to the teaching, does Brown have a medical school?
They do.
And it has an undergraduate school?
Yes.
Do you teach at both, or one or the other, or what have you done in that regard?
Historically, I've taught both in the undergraduate school when there was a Department of Community Health, and in the medical school, in a variety of formats, and in the residency. So I used to precept in family medicine, teaching residents. Now my course is in the School of Public Health, which is relatively new. I think most of my students are here at this deposition, observing.
What is the course that you're teaching right now that has brought these students to us today?
That's
Section form.
They'll have to tell me the title again because it changed, but it's Science and Power, corporate corruption of public health, I think, something like that.
In this course that you're teaching this semester with the students that are here with us today, do you teach in part about the NCAA?
Yes, this class is right now in session
And you've
on that topic.
and you've taught over the years about the NCAA, correct?
Yes, from time to time.
Why is the NCAA a proper subject in your mind for this course?
Well, because it's an example of where risks were known, warnings could have been given, rules could have been made to prevent those risks, and it didn't happen. So it's an important case study about how things went wrong. And in addition, it's an area for potential intervention. Okay, so that I'm trying to encourage the students who are leading this part to try to help the NCAA out by developing a course on concussions so that it can be, because no such course exists, the NCAA doesn't have such a course. And so they're going to try to develop that course for the NCAA.
Objection.
And that's part of the course, because the course deals with not just learning about things, but actually tries to encourage them to change things to make things better.
If we're
Objection,
looking
non-responsive.
into preventative medicine with respect to the NCAA, what types of documents or testimony or literature or information would you look to undertake such a project?
Well, the first thing is to know what was known about these risks and when it was known, and put things into a historical context. And then the second would be to describe the risks. And I think it's particularly instructive for people to understand what the NCAA knew and what they didn't do. Because people they think that the NCAA is taking responsible action, and they think the little bit that's been done, like there's a poster that's out. The Brown program consists more or less of a poster on the web and an online hour of looking at things, looking at issues related to concussion. That's inadequate to explain to people what the real risks are. So those are the things. And we'd look at also all the things we know about how to educate people. Because we're at a university. The NCAA is made up of universities with all kinds of expertise in how to educate people. But none of that expertise has been brought to bear on this. And so we need to know what those expertises are, and we need to bring them to the table to help them implement training programs for students so that these injuries can be reduced or eliminated.
Objection.
One of the
non-responsive.
things you were asked earlier today is whether or not you consider yourself to be a historian. And I think we had some objections and so forth with that, so I want to clear that up. Doctor, do you consider yourself to be a historian?
Yes, in the areas that I look at. That's what I do. I publish the history of who knew what when, and why things did happen and why things didn't happen with respect to public health interventions.
I mean, would it be accurate if next to who knew what when, if I put the word history? Is that a fair word to summarize that, or would you say it differently?
No, that's fair.
If it, for example, in this case, if we're trying to figure out what did the NCAA know, when did they know it, what did they do with it or not do with it, what's the best source of information?
The NCAA and their documents and the depositions and testimony of their personnel.
Have you reviewed the documents the NCAA has produced in this litigation?
Yes.
Have you reviewed the testimony that's been provided in this litigation?
Yes.
Objection form.
Are those documents and testimony part of the basis of your opinions?
Yes.
Objection form.
Why are the corporate documents and testimony important to your opinions, generally speaking?
Objection.
I mean, is it solely because it tells you the who knew what when, or is there some other part of it?
Objection form. Objection leading.
It tells you more. It tells you that the NCAA knew certain things should be done to prevent injuries. Certain rules should be implemented to prevent injuries, and that they didn't do those things. And it's important for people to understand that to make an informed decision about whether or not they want to take the risks of playing these sports at NCAA institutions.
You heard some questioning today about what the consensus was in the scientific community. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Do you have an understanding of whether or not that scientific community had access to the 400, 500,000 pages that have been produced in this case and the testimony in this case?
Objection form.
Yes.
What is your understanding?
They did
Objection
not.
form.
Doctor, is one of the depositions you looked at a corporate representative by the name of Kevin Lennon?
Yes.
Was his testimony important to you in this case?
Objection form.
Yes.
Can you give me some examples of why Mr. Lennon's testimony was important to you?
Objection form.
Because in response to almost every question he was asked, he said he didn't know, but the answer was in the documents. But he hadn't looked at the documents to know what the answer was. And so that's exactly what I did. I agree with him. The answer to those important questions is known, and it's in the documents. The difference is I read the documents, and I came here with opinions about what was known when based on those documents.
Do you have an
Objection
opinion?
non-responsive.
Do you have an opinion as to whether or not corporate representatives of the NCAA charged with health and safety should have knowledge of what's in those corporate documents?
Objection form.
Yes,
And what is that opinion?
Objection
They-
form.
they should know what the NCAA knew about how to prevent these injuries and what they knew about the magnitude of the injuries and what they knew about what they didn't do to implement the things that they said they should do.
Doctor, do you have an opinion as to whether or not the NCAA concealed health information from athletes?
Objection
Yes.
form.
What is that opinion?
Objection
They
form.
did.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
That is a very bad thing.
Why is that bad?
Objection
Well,
form.
let's take the helmet example. They knew that 48% of the helmets that were being used didn't meet the minimum standards that they set up, and they kept that information secret from the players.
Did you see any information indicate that Greg Pletz was told his helmet is defective?
Objection form.
No.
Are you familiar with the NCAA document that stated that the helmets were concussion proof? Did you see that?
Objection
Yes.
form. Objection leading.
First of all, did that document appear to you to be a truthful representation of the science?
No.
Did it appear to you to be a misrepresentation of science?
Objection
Yes.
form.
Did it appear, let me ask you this, Doctor. Do you have an understanding of whether the NCAA expects folks to rely on its public statements?
Yes.
What is that opinion?
Objection form.
They do.
Did you understand that the statement about helmets being concussion proof was publicly made?
Yes.
Objection form.
And do you have an understanding of about what year that took place? Do you recall? Let me ask it a different way. Do you understand whether that took place during the years Greg Pletz was playing college football at the University of Texas?
Yes.
Objection leading.
And what is your understanding?
That's when it occurred. I don't remember exactly what year or years. I think it was over more than 1 year.
All right. Now, we talked a little bit about the warnings chapters that you published. Do you have other publications you've had over the years?
Yes.
Can you generally describe those? I know some are in your CV, but if there are there some you'd like to particularly point out to the jury?
I mean, they're all dealing with different issues that relate to worker health. Some relate to what was known when about worker health issues and why protections were or were not implemented to deal with known risks. And some are about more technical medical issues. In other words, I published papers on flavorings and how they cause lung disease and asbestos and lung cancer. So some are on technical scientific questions and some are on history and public health issues.
Doctor, do you have an opinion as to whether or not from the fall of 1967 until January 1, 1972, Greg Pletz was a worker?
Yes.
What is that opinion?
He was a worker.
Did you see any evidence that Greg Pletz was provided warnings regarding the risks of that work?
No,
Objection form.
Is that good or bad?
that is very bad.
Do you have an opinion as to whether or not an entity like the NCA should have disclosed everything it knew about health and safety to one of its workers like Greg Pletz?
Yes,
And what is that opinion?
they should.
Objection form.
They should have.
Now, with all this medicine that you've done, let's be clear as well, have you actually practiced medicine with respect to football players over the years?
Yes.
Can you briefly describe that to the jury?
Sure, I started doing that when I was a medical student actually in Mississippi, because Dr. Smith would do physicals on all kinds of sports teams on a regular basis. He did that because, in general, that population never saw physicians. So the only time they got to see physicians would be when he would go examine them for sports. And so I participated with him and learned how to do those exams from him.
Did you warn these kids or their parents about the risks of future brain damage from playing football?
No,
Well, why not?
because I wasn't aware of the magnitude of the problem. The things that I read that the NCAA did and knew in these documents was not information that I could have obtained, was not information that was available. The things that the NCAA knew they should do, and that high school and junior high school kids should have rules to protect themselves, those were not published anywhere. Those were secret. And there was no way for me to obtain that information, no matter how diligent I was.
Objection not responsive.
One of the things that you and I have discussed that I don't know if you got into with the NCAA's counsel is you've had some concerns you've expressed to me about the NCAA's designation of some documents historically as confidential and in these litigations. Have we had that discussion?
Yes.
Why does that bother you?
Objection form.
Well, I think that when these documents become public, there will be a public outcry over NCAA's callous disregard for the health and safety of football players in this country. And they will be forced through public pressure, perhaps congressional legislation, perhaps state legislation, to change what they're doing and to implement every protection that they've secretly known about over the last century and more. And it'll also force them to provide compensation to people who are injured as a result of playing these sports, rather than just having used them as tools for their personal and institutional financial gain.
Well, Doctor, why can't I rely on the NCAA to do the right thing itself?
Objection non responsive to the previous answer. Objection form to that question.
Well, I think the evidence that I've gone over here indicates that the NCAA denies, creates doubt, and hides what they know about those risks. And there's no indication, reading these depositions from Heinlein and their corporate representatives, Wilford, that they're doing anything else. Just to read those depositions is to understand the mentality of the NCAA, to understand that their intent is to hide what they know, to not answer clearly what they knew and what they didn't do. And there's no indication from those recent depositions, I mean within the last month or two, that there's been one item of change in their conduct.
Objection non responsive. Objection form.
Can we just take a quick break?
Absolutely. Can we go off the record?
Going off the record, the time is 6:13.